Welcome back, everybody. I've got something really cool that I want to share with you today. So this is a lens that Leica produced for the US military back in 1972. So only about 550 copies of the original lens were actually ever made. And if you can find one today, they usually go for really high prices at auctions, usually like to the tune of about $30,000. That's if you can even find one. So this is actually a replica of that lens. This one is made by Light Lens Lab. This is the Light Lens Lab 50mm f2 Elcan. The good news is for those of us that aren't millionaires, that the Light Lens Lab replica is pretty much identical. In fact, impressively identical to the original, right down to the actual glass types used for the optical formula. And you can get this brand new instead of a lens that's 50 years old that was used by the military for just a fraction of the cost. This is just under $1,000. The original Leica lens was paired with the Leica KE7A body in the military contract. And the KE7A is essentially an M4 that was brought up to military spec. This lens, on the other hand, is a completely unique design from the 50mm Summicron version that Leica was producing at that time. In fact, it is unlike any Summicron 50mm lens that Leica have ever produced. Given the fact that this lens is so scarce and any copies in existence are in the hands of collectors, the Light Lens Lab replica is extremely important as it gives us an interesting insight into a very rare Walter Mandler design. The thumbprint of the 50mm Elcan is extremely interesting. So first of all, it's very sharp. It's extremely sharp, actually, and impressively so for such a simple optical design. When you're shooting with this lens wide open, the sharpness does fall off near the corners. That's to be expected of a lens in the 70s. Note that we don't lose focus per se, as there's just a drop in resolution. Of course, stopping the lens down brings the performance up considerably with high resolution across the entire frame. As you stop down, the performance begins to look more along the lines of what we get out of modern lenses today. In terms of sharpness, this lens gets compared a lot to the current Summicron lens, and while I've used both, and the Elcan is in fact very sharp, particularly if you stop down, the still outperforms it by a long shot, as it should, because it's a modern lens and was designed nearly 50 years later. But here's the great thing about vintage design. So some photographers feel that the 50 Apo is too sharp and modern, like when you do portraits and every skin texture comes out. This is where I would actually recommend the 50 Elcan, as it still offers high resolving power, but it maintains some wonderful characteristics that you're going to find in vintage lens design, and it's a lot easier on your wallet as well. So for most general purpose types of photography, I do like to shoot this lens wide open. That's where you're going to get the full-on character that this lens actually gives you. There's a really cool 1960s, 1970s look to the out-of-focus areas. You do see a little bit of astigmatism with lines and shapes in the abstracts that start to double up at times. And I realize that we're talking about a paintbrush lens at this point, but that's exactly what I like about this. It's got a really unique character that honestly is a little outside the classic Leica look, but it's still really interesting just the same. The spherical highlights, or the bokeh balls as some people say, they have a very defined look. They've got a hard edge around the circles. This is somewhat expected for an early 1970s lens with no spherical elements. Some people call this soap bubble bokeh, much like what you see on the early Meyer-Gorlitz lenses of the 1960s. And of course, as you start to learn this lens and the look that it's going to give you and these unexpected things, you can actually use them to your advantage. It's something that's very cool. This lens was obviously designed to work with film, but I'm really impressed with how well it works with a digital camera. The contrast is very well balanced. The resolution is impressive, especially for an older design like this. Like I said, this lens does have a 1960s, 1970s feel to it, and I feel it looks really good when you edit for a film look. So in other words, you got to match the contrast. A few years ago, I actually started a project to design various color profiles and presets based around various film stocks, and I just did this for my own work. I wanted to get the right color balance, wanted to get the contrast that you see with films, and especially the stuff that I was used to and wanted to be able to replicate. So, for example, Fujifilm Provia has a very beautiful contrast profile. I like the way the reds and the greens render. I love the way that the highlights roll off. The contrast is just perfect. I spent a year emulating various Fujifilm stocks to bring them into my digital workflow. The best part about this is you have all the benefits of digital. So you can rescue highlight detail when possible. You can also bring up shadow detail, and you can further control the contrast profile if it's too strong or it's too soft for a particular image. So after I had the 16 Fujifilm stocks that I was really getting happy with, I decided, well, why not try this with Kodak emulations as well? Some of these have actually been long out of production, and they were not easy to do, like the various Kodachrome types. I actually have 6 different Kodachrome emulations from the vintage 1930s look to the last run they did in the 1990s. Some of my favorite looks include the Kodak Portra 160 types. These were C41 films that were really good for natural light, especially for skin tones. These presets work great, obviously, with any lens and camera combination, but they really give the Elcan 50mm an extraordinary look that complements the era that this lens is from. So last year I decided to make these presets available for anybody who wants to use them. They're available for both Lightroom and Capture One, so if you're interested, check them out. I'll drop a link in the description below this video. So one of the most impressive things to me about this lens, this is what I want to share with you in this video, is the optical design. There are only 4 elements used in the optical formula. There's no compound or grouped elements. It's extremely simple, and it's really impressive that the performance is this high for a minimal design. This is a Walter Mandler design, and I think in many ways it just shows how brilliant a lens designer he really was. So the key to success with this lens design is actually the glass materials used to make these elements. So as I mentioned, there are only 4 elements. There are no groups, there's no compound elements. 4 elements, everything is air-spaced. This would give us 8 glass-to-air surfaces, and for the coatings at that time, that was probably very acceptable. Glass material options, however, were way more limiting in the 70s than they are today. The first element in this lens is lanthanum crown glass, sometimes known as Lac 9. The second lens element is a Light's glass formula that was probably done in their glass lens lab. The third is a dense flint glass, and the fourth is a lanthanum flint glass. So what is the significance of lanthanum, and what is it, you might be asking? Well, a lot of early lenses, because we didn't have the optical choices in terms of the glass materials, a lot of early lenses that go back to the 1940s, they actually used thorium dioxide, which it actually is radioactive. Thorium is probably not going to kill you, and to have any damage, you'd have to have prolonged exposure where you're actually touching the glass or actually touching your eye with it. Like binoculars could be a problem, but in lenses, well, radioactivity tends to freak people out a little bit. Thorium was used in lenses at that time because it does feature a high index of refraction with a low dispersion. So this makes it easy to make lenses that have low distortion and other aberrations. So this is an early example where lanthanum came into play because it replaced thorium. And so lanthanum was desirable because it gives you the same optical qualities, but it's 99.91% stable. What's really cool about this lens is that Light Lens Lab have reproduced everything, including the original glass material. So they are using lanthanum in this lens. Lanthanum hadn't been used in decades. In fact, even some of the bigger companies like Nikon and Leica, when they've done their historical reissue lenses, have switched out the elements. And this is debatable, but I tend to think, as a lot of other people do, that you can tell a visual difference in the final image with a lens that uses lanthanum versus one where it's been replaced. Not here though. Light Lens Lab have done just about as close a replica as anyone could do for the Elcan 50. So a few things I found very interesting when I was researching this lens for you guys here. First of all is the name. When this was released, it was a military spec name, so it had a really catchy name. It was called the Type 246. Elcan is the nickname, and it actually refers to the factory in Canada that Leica built in the 1950s, where this lens was designed. So Leica opened its Canadian factory in Midland, Ontario in 1952. Dr. Walter Mandler was the chief lens designer at Leica. He moved there to oversee operations at the factory, and he actually never went back to Germany. He ended up living in Midland until his passing in 2005. So the name Elcan is an abbreviation for Ernst Lights Canada. The factory is still there, but it's a Raytheon factory today. I know for a while they continued to produce optics for Leica. I do not know if this is still the case. And according to Leica researcher extraordinary, the late Erwin Putz, Dr. Mandler actually really enjoyed doing the military contract lenses because it gave him an opportunity to experiment and do some work outside of the Leica tradition. As very few records actually exist of the actual military project for this lens, there are a lot of theories and a few myths that you're going to find on the internet. For example, the KE7A camera, it was designed for more abusive field use. It's like a beefed up M4. This lens, however, I have read that the reason there are only 4 single elements in here is it was designed to survive bomb blasts and extreme heat. If the lens gets hot enough, you could have balsam separation. There are a lot of theories, and explosions, sure, I could see that they would spec a lens to that, but honestly, I think some of that is a little bit of mythology. This was a military contract, and they only made 500 of these, and so I think the reason that it was kept to a simple 4-element design was cost. It needed to be cheap to make. Actually, cheap might not be the right word. Let's go with simple, because it does kind of cater to both my theory and the other theories as well. But anyway, either way, this lens is impressively sharp, so don't let the simple design fool you on this, actually. For something that was done in in the 1970s that performs as high as this lens does, I think this is more of a testament to the genius of Dr. Mandler at Leica. It really is impressive. It's also important to mention Light Lens Lab, who actually made this replica. This is the second replica lens that I have reviewed on this channel. I also reviewed their version of the Cooke Speed Pancro 2, which was a design from the 1940s. I did a video on that last month if you haven't seen it. It's a really cool lens. Also, I'll put a link up here somewhere. But anyway, Light Lens Lab did that lens. They also did this lens. I think that from a historical perspective, Light Lens Lab is doing some of the most important work in photography optics today. Their whole thing is making replicas of early lens designs with modern manufacturing techniques. They're the only company that is doing this today and operate in a very high level of standard. They're very faithful to the original designs, especially the materials used, including glass. Light Lens Lab started a couple years ago, 2018, in Shangrao by the very elusive and very mysterious optical designer known as Mr. Zhou. The Elcan 50mm f2 is the second lens in what is an impressive and extensive roadmap that's going to enable photographers and filmmakers to have access to lenses that are currently out of production and really prohibitively expensive. As I said, I've been using this lens for the past few months. It is an absolute joy to use. It's light, it's tiny. It's an excellent lens for everyday usage. Most importantly, it's stealth, and it's also unobtrusive. This makes it an excellent candidate for street photography. There's a focusing tab, and the focus throw is 180 degrees. It's perfect for precision focusing. One thing that is a little strange, though, is the aperture works backward from other Leica lenses. This is actually the same on the original Elcan 50. There's also a little tab over the aperture. I think this was actually a military spec for probably working in gloves. It's actually kind of nice to have. It's definitely not in the way. You get used to the aperture differences pretty quickly, and honestly, it's not a big deal. The aperture does work in half-stop increments, exactly like the original lens. Build quality on the Elcan 50 is very impressive. Everything is smooth, it's well machined. It feels like pretty much any Leica lens that I've used that's been released. The packaging is very impressive as well, as the lens comes in a very large box and also has a large lens case. My only criticism here is that the case is massive, and I'm sure this was done to accommodate future lenses of larger sizes so you don't have to have different sizes of cases. But it's very big, and it's almost too big to drop into a bag. It's just a small criticism, but it's worth noting. So let's talk about alternatives for a lens like this. This actually becomes very difficult because this is such a specific lens design. It's actually based on a very rare lens. So the obvious alternative would be to spend like $30,000 and see if you can track down the original at an auction. Another period correct choice for something like this would be the Leica 50mm f2 Summicron lenses. However, it is worth noting the Summicron is a very different lens design than this, and it's just a different look. Another possibility would be the old Nikon f2 50mm rangefinder lenses that were produced in the 1950s and the 1960s. Those are very cool lenses as well. It is, however, notable that those are actually Zeiss sonar designs, and so they are a very different look than what you're going to get out of here. But something to the period that's going to cost you probably less than this, that's still fun to use, I would take a look at the Nikon rangefinder lenses. Mentioning alternatives for this lens is kind of funny, actually, because this lens is an alternative to the original $30,000-ish lens that you're going to find that's a collector's item. That in mind, I think that the price point on this lens makes it a very easy sell for anyone who's interested. So if you want to know where you can get this lens, I will put some links in the show description. I bought mine. It was on sale at Pop Flash. I highly recommend them. Also, Light Lens Lab finally have their website up. They've got a really cool development blog of some of the new projects they're working on, so I'll put a link to that in the description as well. And if you want to see some more examples of what this lens will do, I will drop a link in the description for Kevin Zhu's work on Flickr. Kevin Zhu was involved with this project on this particular lens. He actually owns the original, and on his Flickr page he has a lot of back and forth tests of the same shot done with the original lens and the replica lens. It's really impressive to see how close they are. And as always, if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.